Thank you all for coming. Maybe we just go down and you guys introduce yourselves. And I guess what does governance and decentralization mean to you?
So first off, I'm Gustav. I'm responsible for the business development of MakerDAO in Europe, and I also do a lot of the projects we have in both Asia and Africa. And MakerDAO is a permissionless lending protocol where the product is a stablecoin, a decentralized stablecoin. So for us, decentralization and governance means that we take a financial system and we completely separate it from political and jurisdictional scrutiny and issues, and we make it open for everyone. And when you do that, then we need to have a governance module that is also not attached to a centralized entity. So that's like our base premise of how we do governance and how our structure is.
Sadeh, very pleased to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm the founder of Saga, and Saga is a protocol for creating a central bank, if you want, a decentral bank, in the sense, and we're not defining ourselves as a stable coin in the sense that we're not stable by design, but we do have stabilization mechanisms. We want to grow or to shrink very slowly. In the matter of decentralization and governance, I actually think it's a bit redundant because I really believe that decentralization is only about governance. And the word governance is a misleading one because when we hear governance, we usually refer to it as a meta discussion, right? There is the thing itself and then there is the governance of the thing. While when it comes to blockchain, I think that governance is the thing. If you take Bitcoin or any other, let's take Bitcoin for example, you could implement it with way less energy, way more efficiency, and get rid of a lot of the problems if you would implement it on a 40 years old centralized technology. But then the only thing that you would change would be the governance, who takes decisions, who monitors the execution of the protocol. And so for me, discussing blockchain is inherently just discussing governance.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tegan Kline. I head up international business development at Orchid, and Orchid is creating a suite of privacy tools to keep the internet open and free. I would say governance is essentially collective decision making, and if you had to reduce it down to one word, I would say it would be control. And I actually take an opposing position because I think that governance is inherently centralized.
Bold. My name's Lawrence. I head up research at Outlier Ventures, a venture firm based out of the UK. I take a pretty, I guess, contrarian view of what governance is based on my background in politics. Some of the work I've done in the past was the devolution of certain powers from the UK Parliament to Scotland. And how that was done. So I'm pretty interested in devolution of power, and which I guess in this world we call decentralization of power. And I hold that any true form of truly decentralized decision making ends up in tyranny of structurelessness, which means that we end up with informal power structures, not formalized power structures. So I'm of the view that we actually need to define who has powers in a network, and I would be of the inclination to create separate bodies that are held accountable. So an executive, a legislative, and a judiciary that have particular powers and checks and balances. So that's what I would like to see happen.
Cool. Well, Scotland is very topical.
So is the UK. Yeah.
So is the UK. Well, okay. So that kind of leads into one of my questions. Does there exist a minimal required bureaucracy or set of structures in governance to establish governance to the point of legislative, executive, etc.? Is there a minimal viable governance structure? And what does that look like? And what does that look like in a decentralized system?
So I don't think there's like a minimal, right? So one thing you need to be very aware about is that like the more decentralized you make the governance, the more inefficient it is, right? I mean, if you need 1 million people to vote on a subject, that's gonna take quite a long time. And that's like, of course, like on the like very, very fine of the scale. And then in the other end, you have, one person sitting in a room is like, oh, that's how it is. That's like very efficient, like very fast. So for me and like what we see at Maker, right? Then of course you need to figure out like who actually needs to participate in which votes, and like where do you want to have, you know, like the very decentralized votes, and like what are like the truly important topics. And that's also something we see, you know, just in like the traditional structure, you know, when you have like, you know, the government vote, you know, when you vote for the next prime minister, that's like a pretty inefficient vote. It takes like several days. It's like, you know, a lot of people spending their time on it and everything. So I don't think there's like a minimum, but you need to figure out, you know, what is like the importance of the structure you set up. So for us, for example, we have, you know, we have like when like later this year we launch something called multi-collateral DAI, where we will start to have other asset types than only crypto assets in our smart contracts. And when those assets going to get voted in, you need to have someone evaluating the risk parameters of those assets, right? So if we wanted all of our voters to become like risk experts all of a sudden, so they could give, you know, their personalized opinion of vote on like that specific asset, like very, very inefficient, right? And we couldn't require that amount of like, you know, acquirance of like knowledge from like our like every, you know, like every single voter. So instead that process is going to be put out to like a risk team, where instead the risk team is going to get voted in, but they're essentially going to be, you know, like the expert opinion on like that matter, right? And I think that's a little bit what you mentioned as well. You want, you know, like separate bodies of like who actually, you know, votes on what, right?
So I think that for a blockchain panel, we are all contrarians to pure blockchain as a governance. I think that decentralization is a tool. It's not an end to itself, and it's mostly a tool to answer the agent's dilemma. But it's, again, I would definitely agree, it's an inefficient tool, and in terms not only of scalability, but of lack of expertise, of lack of acting urgently. And I think that instead of speaking in dichotomies between centralized and decentralized system, we should consider it as a spectrum. And what's really interesting is the tensions. There are tensions. If you are not out there to build an organization that aims to represent its participants, then decentralization is not an issue at all. If you are building an organization that aims at representing participants, then you need to maintain a very meticulous balance between representation of what they want and the ability to carry out this representation. And full decentralization is not allowing to do that because of the lack of efficiency, because of the lack of expertise. And so I think that we have a lot to learn, even if we're very critical of the nation state. We have a lot to learn of layered systems of governance that are tackling different changes and are maintaining checks and balances between them. And I think that what's interesting in blockchain is that it allowed us, for the first time in many years, to consider that we can have another type of entity between the nation state and the corporate that would take a little bit of both, along with code governance for the execution of a protocol. And I think that eventually we'll see more and more the differences between the project would not be whether they're centralized or decentralized, but rather how do they carry out this multi-layer of governance institutions. So the short question is, yes, I think that there is a minimum set of required institutions as long as an organization is carrying out a rather complicated mission.
Yeah, I would say that governance is essentially a centralizing force, in that you have, even in Maker, where it is arguably, in my opinion, the best decentralized on-chain governance that exists today. Even in Maker, you have Maker that governs DAI. There's only one Maker. There's not multiple Makers, right? So you have to kind of abide by the rules that are set forth by Maker. And so in Orchid, what we've done is we've kind of removed that need for governance as much as we can, where we allow each individual that's taking part in the bandwidth transaction to set their own rules. And that is completely private unless they choose to expose that.
Hard to go last when you agree with many of the points, but so I'll try and make a slightly different point. That the missing word, I think, is legitimacy. And I think legitimacy is what sometimes leads to contentious forks, but in the real world leads to civil wars and breakups of parties. So I'm of the view that if there is buy-in, there is a legitimacy, there is a set of values that are aligned between the creators or the executive, to use the language of the code makers, and those that are securing the network, and the users, and there's an agreed legitimacy that the network is running for certain objectives and values, I think you can go a long way. And I think what that actually refers to is some form of constitution, actually, because you don't need to define all of the checks and balances early on. And in fact, I think you would create quite a fragile governance structure if you did. So I think the best way to do an MVP of governance is some form of constitution that there's consultation period on that sets out what the values of the network will be, i.e., if there is a disagreement, we will always tend to choose a privacy-preserving technology or whatever it might be. I don't think it should be too complex. I think it should be, a few pages on GitHub or something that we can vote on and agree on. But at that point, there is a value alignment, and then all of the bureaucracy that comes around that will be built based on those values and that culture that's determined. I think maybe that's what we've missed with certain networks that are developed, is that it's not clear 100% what the networks necessarily stand for. Maybe Ethereum is a different example compared to others, but I think maybe that's where we could end up with an MVP.
Cool. So legitimacy is an interesting one. I mean, you're channeling Vlad Zamfir because he loves to talk about legitimacy and where does it come from. The constitution thing is interesting, but in something like Bitcoin, if you were to try and institute a constitution on Bitcoin, it would be, I would bet on outright rejected, right? So there is like an aspect of crypto anarchy that plays into this as well. I really like the phrasing of blockchains are somewhere in between governments and corporates. So like I guess the question is, are blockchain systems like Bitcoin and Ethereum, are they sovereign in and of themselves? Like, do they have legitimacy, or are we still trying to figure all of that out?
I mean, I guess that depends on your definition of legitimacy. But I mean, from like my point of view, like you have so many people where their like livelihood, a lot of people, their like entire economy, like welfare and everything is dependent on it, right? The same thing as you see with the government, right? I mean, people, we don't live by like and abide by like the Ethereum rules, because frankly we don't need to. They're like embedded automatically in the system, right? And I think that that's one of the things that's so important for me about like decentralization, is that you set up these systems that they're trustless, right? You don't need to trust each other to be able to cooperate and make initiatives in these systems, and that's what the governance is enforcing, right? Because the governance is also often like embedded in like the technical restrictions of what you can and cannot do. So I think like you said that, like a constitution, but for me like a constitution is something that's probably like off chain, right? But for me, like a lot of the rules and like the governance, like most of it should be done on chain, because as soon as you take something off chain, then you also open up for the possibility of people abusing it, right? Because I mean, if it's not something that is embedded to like in the rules from the beginning, then you could have people who would like go out of it, or people who would go against it, or people who would group up and then be like, since it's not enforced by the blockchain, they could make a like a group that would say like, well, this might be like privacy dominant, but we think that it's actually something else, so we just go with it.
Can I just respond? I think the challenge with that model is that it ignores that most of the lead up, the campaigning to a vote, happens off chain anyway. And if we don't appreciate that, then you end up with a centralization of power and control over, let's call it a technocracy, those that know the answer. For example, if there's a very technical vote on Aragon, I'm pretty much going to trust a couple of people on who I think most likely knows the answer to the solution better than I do. So I'm going to defer, or at least think that they know best, so I'm going to follow their vote. And the worry around just only enforcing, only looking at the vote itself, is that it ignores all of the surrounding campaigning, knowledge transfer, education that happens outside of that. So I think we have to acknowledge that the majority of governance happens off-chain. The decisions can execute on-chain, but we need a broader view of what governance is than just the execution, whilst agreeing that I think most of the execution should happen on-chain. There's an awful lot outside.
I agree, and I think that this is a very important distinction of the procedures for executing a protocol and the procedures for changing and taking decisions about the protocol, which I don't believe will be left to on-chain operations in themselves. I think that trustlessness answers only a segment of decisions making of an organization, but trust is a very important measure, and I don't think that we can relinquish it. If we will create organizations that would be trailing those organizations who are basing themselves on trust, on representation, on expertise, on this is a set of, it's like a toolbox, and I don't see a reason to renounce very powerful tools in this toolbox while admitting that decentralization is yet another tool, and scalable, borderless decentralization is an important tool in creating new systems. But I don't think that it is standing in it for itself. In regards to your question, I don't think that Ethereum should aim to be a governed system. I think that it should aim to be a tool, a platform for a segment of governance, which is decentralized governance. And I think that identity has quite a lot to have with it. And you mentioned Vlad Zamfir. I think that with lacking identity, any system would have a very hard time providing a full governance solution.
But, so I just want to add here. I think this is a lot about like what do you define as governance, right? I think both of you guys are like way further ahead compared to what I believe is governance right now, because I'm talking about like the things we're actually doing now, right? Where I think that you guys are talking about like how do you govern, things outside of just, like finance. I mean, I have mostly experience like MakerDAO, right? And I mean, I agree, of course, there's like a lot of knowledge transfer and like campaigning outside of like the protocol itself, but essentially you would want everything to happen on chain, right? So I think, definitely like depending on like what you take governance as, governance is also like a vote for the next prime minister. I mean, of course you wouldn't, you could have that on chain, but it really wouldn't be right, because essentially like the end decision is something that happens off chain. So if the outcome of the vote is something that happens off chain, then I completely agree. Like you couldn't just have something that would, only be living within the blockchain space. So I think it depends a lot like how do you want to define like governance and what is governance to you, because governance is such a broad spectrum, right? I mean, it can mean literally like anything, right?
Yeah, I think it does, but I think that even in our project, this kind of governance is already in place. I mean, claiming that whether Vitalik continues to lead Ethereum or not has no material impact over Ethereum, and that's exogenous to the protocol, I think would be rather naive. And now I don't see an on-chain process determining who is going to lead Ethereum. And I think
that was not like the proposition at all, right?
Sorry?
That was like, for me, it's like when we launch Ethereum 2.0, for example. Of course, the launch of that is very dependent on whether he's with the project or not. But when that launches, then the technical specifications embedded in the protocol upon launch, when they get followed out afterwards, that's the governance I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the development of a project.
And what I'm claiming is that all the unstructured data that surrounds this governance is also a part of the governance. And when we omit it by saying that only what is governed in the protocol is what governance is, then we are giving way to what Lawrence just called the dictatorship of unstructurelessness. So I think this is relevant to the projects we are already dealing with even today.
Yeah, I tend to lean on the side like Vitalik and Vlad of more informal or off-chain governance. But that being said, it is very relative to the blockchain. And also, at Orchid, we're a decentralized application on top of Ethereum. So the scope of what we're solving for is much smaller and layer one solutions have a much more complex problem to solve.
That's exactly the point I wanted to make, and that's perfect. Because actually, I think we're talking about the same thing in that you describe different layers of governance in a national level, whether it's state, federal, local. What I think we're talking about here is if you're building an application or Maker or Orchid protocol or middleware, then the scope of decisions is much narrower, and therefore that's all we need to think about. What I think you're describing, and I guess what I am as well, is this sort of national level, layer one. You're building a public utility. So public utilities need to be governed, made in a much different way, probably one that's more participatory and includes more stakeholders and voices, whereas if you're building a network or a business, therefore it's much narrower, and therefore you need to move faster and needs to have more centralized control. So I think the way to think about it is that the stack probably have different layers of governance depending on the speed they need to move and the sustainability over time.
Yeah, and I would also just say that like a company in itself is like most of the time a centralized entity, right? I mean, it's the same like at Maker. We're like a centralized foundation that runs a decentralized protocol, right? I mean, I have a boss. My boss has a boss, right? And I mean, their decisions are like what's getting done, right? So you like, and I mean, I expect this similar thing with like the Ethereum Foundation, right? That's also like a centralized company, right? So of course, if you remove like stakeholders from them, I mean, that's not something that we could vote on chain that like no, you can't leave. I mean, I just had a kid. I want to leave the project for a while. No, you can't. I mean, you said no on the blockchain. It doesn't work, right?
I think that's a part of the problem. We're struggling. We're a UK entity now, and we've built a company limited by guarantee, which we invested about 2 months in taking all the powers of the members of the company so that the powers are with the holders of the currency. I mean, we're literally trying to square a circle in the sense that we're between a corporate and a nation state. If we want to provide, nation states are currently the only organisms that have as aim to represent their citizens. And we're trying to build such organizations, but we lack the legal infrastructure. So we take an elephant and try to convince it is a donkey. We're building a company and then we're saying but the members and shareholders have no powers, only the holders of the company. This is quite an acrobatic, because I think that if we are doing something, it is inventing a new form of governance, and I don't think that we have the tools yet. But I believe we have it.
Can I just make 2 points on that? I think that's right, and we must remember that the organisation is an invention. Like it was a UK law passed after the South Sea bubble, where we had 2 laws passed over the sort of 5 years. The first one was law of incorporation. So before that, you needed a royal charter to be an organisation. So you needed to go to the king or pass a bill in Parliament to have a business. And then there was a law of incorporation. And then the second most important thing was the law of limited liability. Limited liability meaning you could set up an organisation. You weren't responsible for everything that happened within that organisation. So those are 2 bills that were passed, and I think in this, what we're discussing is right at the very beginning of setting up a new type of organisation. Where that law will be passed, I don't know, and what that law will look like, I don't know. But it will look like you set up a company, and it's not a limited or a GmbH, it's a .DAO or digital organisation. I don't know, but that's probably where we're getting, and we're all struggling because we don't have that law, or we don't have that guidance.
So politicians have a role to play to help us out.
Unfortunately, yeah.
And I guess mixing elephants and donkeys gets to American politics, which will.
I didn't intend. I just thought of 2 animals.
So
we have enough of our own here in Israel. We have elections in 2 days.
Oh, in 2 days. Wow. Okay, cool. So we've got a little bit more time. Maybe just switch gears. So I spend a lot of time paying attention to Maker, and they have, you guys should all check it out. Maker has a weekly community meeting, community/risk meeting, where they actually look at the charts, look at the peg, look at the risk, all this stuff, and then help to inform the community about what's going on with the Maker protocol. So I'm wondering, like, are there like, maybe the answer is, again, specific to the project, but what are the metrics that seem important for measuring engagement with or viability of decentralized governance? Like, what metrics are important here?
Participation. So I would just like add here that so what you wrote for currently in the system is like you look at the past week's data. Then there's like a scientific, like a small presentation. You look at the data, and then you're like, okay, like is the peg as it should be, or should we potentially lower the stability fee? Do we need more DAI in circulation? Like, what do we do going forward the next week? And then it basically ends out in like a proposal, and then there's a vote on. So far it's been like, I mean, it's definitely interesting, and there's of course other topics, but like a little bit of like a dumbed down generalization of it is like, is the peg good? Yes or no? If it's no, is it above or under? And then should we increase or decrease the stability fee based on that? So it's not that complicated yet, right? So that also means that, in participation, we only had around like 15% of participation. But going forward, we will have, votes on a lot of other things. So, should we fund initiatives outside of Maker? Should we adopt, gold as a collateral? Should we adopt this government bond as a collateral? What should we go moving forward with? Like, what would you want to see in the system? So thereby, people actually have a much bigger way of flavoring the Maker system with their own assets and wishes. So I believe that when that happens, we really hope to see the participation also go up, right? But I think definitely like participation. Do people wanna vote on these things? Is this something that's interesting to them? I'd also say another thing right now in decentralized systems, especially when you vote with because often the rights of voting is within a value accrual token, right? So usually people vote with their finance, with their economy. You also have seen reputational voting, which I believe is an easier way to get a lot of representation, because when you do financial voting, it also means that people need to send their tokens to a smart contract, right? So, I know a lot of people who just haven't, gone through this complicated setup of voting through a proxy contract, but rather, they would need to send their own tokens. So that makes people, especially VCs, a little bit nervous, right? Because what if you accidentally, 11 at night when you were supposed to vote before you went home from the office, accidentally send your Maker tokens to the wrong address? That wouldn't be a very good scenario, right? And some VCs even have, in their foundation that they can only vote if it's, through a custody solution that has embedded voting, implemented voting into it. So right now, I think there's still some technical hurdles that we're looking to move over. But for example, we already now work with one of the biggest custody providers out there that have enabled voting with the Maker token. So that's some of the things we need to actually be able to allow people to vote, because if you have a lot of value behind the voting token, you need to have these things in place, right? But yeah, I would say participation is probably a good way to measure it.
So I think that participation is also a part of choosing on the spectrum of decentralization. I don't believe that all participants want to take part in all decision making. And the way we resolved it is that in our assembly, which is the liquid part of our democracy, you can either choose a delegate to vote for you, which you can change at all time, or you can delegate yourself. You can vote on your own, but if you're not voting on your own, nor are you delegating the power to vote, you'll start paying transaction fees, because we consider that you are a visitor of the system. You're not a citizen. But we do give this possibility to say on such subjects, I do not want to vote, I'm not sure I have anything interesting to say, nor do I have the energy to participate, I want to delegate my vote. And another issue is the question of how to vote. What do you vote according to? Stake, identity, reputation, there are many solutions. And in our case, because we're a central bank or a pseudo-central bank, it seems logical to vote by stake. If you hold 1 million sagas, you have more to be impacted by the governance than if you hold one. At the same time, we want to avoid plutocracy. And so we used our old friend Gini, the Gini index, to apportion between identity and stake, so that if the inequality coefficient is high in the system, then we lean towards identity, otherwise stake is leaned. And I think this is also a part of participation. What is it that you're participating with your reputation, with your assets, or with your identity? And I think it's one of the questions.
How do you guys solve identity there? Do you need to pass KYC, or?
So funnily enough, we started by KYCing our participants because of regulatory compliance. And then when we got to realize that we need identity in the governance, we already had it. So obviously in the system itself, they are pseudo-anonymous. We're not using their identity, but we're using the uniqueness of their identity. But yes, we believe that, again, we started off by exogenous reasons to be compliant with regulators, but designing the governance system, we believe that identity is a critical part of designing any system that is about to govern people. And we're happy we have the ability to do so.
Do you then block transfers to addresses you haven't KYC'd? I mean, could I split? Okay.
Yeah, so anyone wishing to hold Saga can do it on an ERC20 wallet, but the wallet needs to be a part of a whitelist that is conditioned upon the KYC process. Yeah. And it's probably going to hurt our conversion into some extent. But again, we're looking at it in the long run, and more that it is important for the regulators, it is important for us to be able to build a democratic system that governs people.
Yeah, I agree. It's participation, and with Orchid, it is, I guess, the buyers of the bandwidth and the sellers of the bandwidth. So it'll kind of come down to the users.
As a final point, then, I would just participation is the best we have at the moment, but I would caution, because if we're at the very beginning of the S-curve of adoption of these technologies, then we have the most engaged, the people that are most interested in the underlying governance of the technology, they're most likely to vote. And if we start onboarding people that don't care so much about the underlying systems they're using and just they're getting some utility or they're holding some asset, then we're going to find ourselves with a growing network for which the participation rate continues to decline. So we need to find a way, and I think the word is social contract, but there needs to be some sort of metric around a social contract which isn't around participation. I don't know what that is. I hope we'll figure it out soon, but that would be what we need.
Cool, awesome. So our time is up. Thank you all. This was great, and the governance discussion in Web3 and decentralized technologies is going to continue to go on. It doesn't end here. So thank you all.
Thank you.